Beyond the orbit of Mars, in the realm known as the asteroid belt, lies an object that has been puzzling scientists for years. At first glance, Psyche seems to be just another of the million or so members of the belt, an asteroid that's on the larger side, but otherwise pretty unremarkable. It's only when you look closer that you start to appreciate how weird it really is. While most asteroids are thought to be rock, Psyche appears to be mostly metal, a mix of iron and nickel, studded with silicate. But it's not just the asteroid's composition that makes it so intriguing, but what that composition might mean. There's every chance that rather than a regular space rock, Psyche is an exposed protoplanetary core, the long-dead heart of some alien worlds that never finished forming. A dead core that humanity is now on the verge of visiting. As you watch this, NASA has either just launched or is about to launch the Psyche mission, a probe that will spend 6 years traveling to this distant world to uncover its secrets, a probe that will finally confirm or deny the exposed core theory, a probe that will soon explore our solar system's metal world. If you've come across the Psyche mission in the news, you may have seen it framed as NASA investigating a $10 quintillion asteroid. The 10 quintillion figure, occasionally reported as 10,000 quadrillion, is supposedly an estimate of Psyche's worth based on the metals that it's thought to contain. We say supposedly here because there is nothing at all rigorous about the calculations behind it. The value is simply a journalistic hook, dreamed up by principal investigator Lindy Elkins Tanton of Arizona State University 6 years ago to keep the press interested. As she tearfully told the New York Times in February, the $10 quintillion figure is fallacious in every way. Still, we mention it because it gets at something deeper, as Elkins Tanton doubtless intended. The fact that when it comes to composition, Psyche is a deeply unusual asteroid. First sighted in 1852 and named after the Greek goddess of the soul, Psyche resides in the asteroid belt, the region of space between Mars and Jupiter, where between 1 and 2 million objects are thought to lurk. Most of those asteroids are thought to be made chiefly of rocks. Those that aren't are broadly some sort of combination of ice and rock. Together, these account for 80% of all known asteroids. But that still leaves 20% in another class. Writing for The Conversation, Psyche mission team member and professor of Earth and Space Exploration at ASU, Jim Bell, claims that, quote, perhaps 20% of asteroids are worlds made of metal and similar in composition to the Earth's core. Of these, the biggest, and by far the best known, is Psyche. Measuring 280 kilometers across and 232 kilometers long, Psyche is a metal monster, the sort of lurking iron beast that Black Sabbath might write songs about. With a 4-hour rotation and an orbit that lasts roughly 5 Earth years, it's an asteroid that we've never seen close up. Although it's possible to pick it out in the night sky using just an amateur telescope, seeing it in any detail from this far away is not. All our information comes from a combination of fuzzy optical imaging and radar observations. Those images of Psyche that you see in the news, they're just artists' impressions, not dissimilar to Albrecht Dürer's famous 1515 attempt to draw a rhinoceros without actually ever having seen one. Luckily, crisp images aren't the only way for us to get information about distant worlds. Despite never having seen it up close, scientists know that Psyche is unusually dense and packed with iron. Originally, it was assumed that the asteroid was entirely metal, though today NASA says it's a combination of metal and silicate, with the metal making up anywhere from 30 to 60% of its body. That's still a spectacularly large amount, especially at the estimate's upper end. Nor is it just Psyche's composition that we can measure. We also think we know its age. It's thought that Psyche formed just 3 to 4 billion years after the solar system first coalesced, a process that took place billions of years ago. That would make it extraordinarily ancient, a remnant of a time when the planets were first forming and our cosmic neighborhood was a nightmare of motion and catastrophe. Appropriately, it may have been one such bygone cataclysm that created Psyche in the first place. Back at the dawn of our solar system, our sun wasn't orbited by the planets that we know today. Instead, our neighborhood was a swirling mess of dust and gas, stuff that over uncountable eons condensed to form larger and larger objects. Eventually, these objects would become places like Earth and Mars, places you learned about in school. But before the planets finished forming, there was a strange midway point, an era in which large planetesimals hurled through space, crashing into one another. Objects large enough to begin separating their interiors into layers, but not yet big enough to call dwarf planets. Among these ancient planetesimals was the exposed core that we now call Psyche. Of course, Psyche wasn't exposed at this point. Instead, it was sat inside a bigger object, one so large that its mass was enough to begin pulling heavier elements inward, creating a molten core. Had the planetesimal it was a part of continued to grow, there's every chance that Psyche would have wound up sitting at the heart of a fully fledged planet, locked away from sight inside another world beyond the orbit of Mars. The had at the start of that last paragraph should give you a clue as to what happened next, suggesting, as it does, a hypothetical event that only played out in some other parallel universe. You see, in our universe, the planetesimal that contained Psyche was doomed. At some point in the formation process, another planetesimal crashed into it with absolutely cataclysmic force. Or maybe there were several crashes over a period of time that one by one destroyed the crust surrounding that young core. Whether it was one big impact or several smaller ones, the result was absolutely the same. Psyche's protective crust was torn away. The core was ripped out and turned molten by the impact. It then cooled in the frozen wastes of space, leaving behind a metal relic, an exposed, damaged core from the earliest days of the solar system, one that survives to this very day. At least, that's the popular story of Psyche's origin, the version that assumes it is indeed an exposed core. There are others too, stories that attempt to theorize how it could come into being if the core theory turns out to be completely wrong-headed. The first of these is also the vaguest. If Psyche isn't a core, then it could be that some unknown process existed in the early solar system that funneled particular materials into particular places. One of those places just happened to be rich with metals. There, separated from other elements, Psyche formed, a freak byproduct of a process that we don't yet understand. Far less vague is the second of these theories, the one involving metal volcanoes. The idea comes from a 2020 paper by planetary scientist Brandon C. Johnson, which sets out an alternative explanation as to how this asteroid came to be coated in iron. According to a summary of their work in National Geographic, the answer lies in the way that Psyche may have cooled across millions of years from the outside in. Assuming Psyche isn't an exposed core, it would have had a core of its own, made from iron, nickel, and sulfur. And that's important because, per the article, to quote, iron and nickel don't crystallize in the presence of sulfur. That means that as Psyche cooled, you'd start to get these weird pockets of sulfur-rich molten metal surrounded by solids. As more of the asteroid's core solidified, the pressure on these pockets would have become insane. Eventually, that pressure would have done to them what squeezing a giant zit does. Caused them to pop in absolutely spectacular fashion. Propelled out at such high pressure, the molten metal would have been capable of traveling through mantle and crust to a distance of nearly 50 kilometers. If Psyche's skin was thin enough, that means the liquid iron and nickel would have sprayed out onto the surface, a process the team dubbed ferrovolcanism. But we prefer the more colloquial version of metal volcanoes. Despite sounding like the name of your cousin's high school rock band, metal volcanoes would explain a lot about Psyche today, from its density to the high levels of iron on its surface. Importantly, it would also mean that it's not an exposed core. Rather, a Psyche that underwent ferrovolcanism would be one with its own core and thick mantle, a planetesimal that simply never grew beyond a certain size. Until NASA gets there in 2029, we'll have no idea which one of these backstories is true. And that brings us rather neatly to the next part of today's video. What will visiting Psyche mean for science? Roughly 3,000 kilometers below your feet, or that's 1,864 miles in America units, lies one of our planet's great mysteries. Earth's core is a giant solid ball of nickel and iron surrounded by a shell of molten metals swirling around our planet's heart. Comprising 20% of our planet's radius, the core is also responsible for cool stuff like our magnetosphere, aka the thing that stops you from dying horribly from solar radiation. Since scientists are clever dudes and dudettes, we have ways to peer into this core from the surface. Measurements that we can make using earthquake waves as they pass through and bounce off of different materials. Inferences that we can make from our magnetic field. But one thing that we can't do is go down there and see the heart of our planet. The deepest hole humanity has ever dug stretches down a mere 12 kilometers. We'd need to extend that depth over 250 times to reach our planet's core, something that is simply impossible with today's technology. And that's why NASA signed off on the Psyche mission back on January the 4th, 2017. If Psyche really is an exposed core, then visiting it won't just tell us cool shit about the early solar system, it will tell us things about the heart of our own planet. The metal heart of Earth, locked away and keeping our world safe for all of these billions of years. Not that discovering Psyche's true nature will be as simple as just flying a probe out there, taking a photo and going, yeah, it looks like a core to me, jobs are getting. Look, the main part of the Psyche probe's mission will be finding out if the asteroid is really what scientists think it is. Something that will require all sorts of specialized instruments taking complicated readings. For instance, the probe's gamma-ray and neutron spectrometer will sniff out exactly what the asteroid is made of, what levels of iron and nickel there are, along with stuff like silicon and oxygen. The precise amounts of iron and nickel will give us a pretty good indication as to whether the exposed core theory is correct. But it's not the only method that the probe will use. Another technique will be to measure Psyche's gravity field. Back in 2020, NASA's OSIRIS-REx probe stunned scientists when it went to collect a sample from the asteroid Bennu. Expected to extract material from a relatively solid surface, it instead encountered one that acted like a liquid. The slightest touch was enough to blast pebbles in all directions. It turns out that Bennu's components were held together extremely weakly. Rather than a solid, it was more like a hollow pile of rubble. Well, measuring Psyche's gravity field will tell us if it falls into the same category. If it does, then there's no way it's an exposed core. But if it turns out to be more dense and solid than Bennu, then that'll be an argument in favor of core theory. And then there's the magnetometer that the craft is going to be carrying. While no one thinks Psyche has its own magnetic field today, if it was a core, then there's every chance that it once did. Having a magnetic field in the past would likely have left traces on its surface. Just as we can today infer Mars's long-dead magnetic field from signatures left in its crust, so too could we do the same for Psyche. Taken together, these readings should confirm or deny the exposed core theory. If it's confirmed, then the next step is trying to figure out if we can apply any findings to our own core beneath the Earth's surface. But even if it turns out that Psyche is no more an exposed core than Piers Morgan is an intellectual titan, that doesn't mean the science is going to be over. For the first time, we humans will have gotten up close to a rare class of asteroid, one which defies our attempts to understand it. By carefully unlocking its secrets, we'll discover things about the dawn of our solar system, about planetary formation, things that perhaps we right now couldn't even guess at. It's an exciting thought, one that suggests we could be on the brink of writing a whole new chapter in our solar system's history. Still, it isn't the only story that we wanted to focus on today. It's time for a quick pivot, because there's another tale to this video, one that, in its own way, is as fascinating as the story of Psyche herself. The story of the probe that is soon going to bring us face to face with this mysterious metal asteroid. Faster, better, cheaper. With those words, in 1992, NASA's administrator Daniel S. Goldin launched a mini-revolution. At the time, the agency was coming off the back of a series of expensive disasters. The Challenger had been lost 6 years earlier. A giant flaw had been detected in the Hubble telescope that would require an expensive repair mission. Just 1 year later, the $800 million Mars Observer probe would be lost en route to the Red Planet. In short, there was a real feeling that NASA in the early 1990s was just burning money. The prestigious journal Nature even ran an editorial titled, "Is NASA an Expensive Failure?" Goldin's answer was to set up a whole new class of missions, capped at a low cost, that would do groundbreaking science at high speed. A mission class that would become known as the Discovery Program. If you're only aware of Discovery as a Star Trek series, you should know the NASA version has been responsible for some of the coolest breakthroughs in planetary science. It was the Discovery mission Pathfinder that in 1998 placed the first rover on Mars, the messenger probe that mapped Mercury, the Dawn spacecraft, a lovable underdog series. All of these came from the same program. It would be this same program that led to the Psyche mission being commissioned. Selected as the 14th Discovery mission in January of 2017, Psyche comes with cost capped far lower than the bigger New Frontiers or flagship mission classes. At least, that's the idea. But while Goldin's first ever Discovery mission, near Shoemaker, launched in 1996 with a price tag of around $400 million in today's money, Psyche will cost almost $1 billion. low cost. This is the result in part of delays that played havoc with the probe's schedule. Partially, this was the result of the unavoidable global pandemic. Scheduled for a 2022 launch, the mission naturally suffered from all of its staff being forced to isolate for months. But it was also partially a result of some serious issues at JPL. The Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL, is a hallowed name in space circles, so we don't want to dump on them too much. But a review board did find last year flaws in staffer communication and management oversights that contributed to Psyche's costly delay. Now, you may remember it from the news last summer. With mere weeks to go until the 2022 launch, it was discovered that the craft's navigation software wasn't going to be ready in time. To call this a minor screw-up would be like calling Gundam a show slightly obsessed with giant robots. The aborted launch not only added an extra year to the schedule, it had a whole ton of knock-on effects. Regarding the Psyche probe itself, the one-year delay ensured that it would miss out on a fortuitous alignment that would have allowed it to slingshot around Mars and arrive at the metal asteroid in 2026. By launching in 2023, the date to start doing science will be pushed back to 2029. Worse still were the effects the delay had on other missions. The Veritas mission to Venus, also part of the Discovery program, was delayed by a minimum of 3 years, so JPL staff could instead focus on cleaning house after the Psyche debacle. The 2 Janus probes that were meant to hitch a ride on the same rocket as Psyche wound up getting cancelled. This after $49 million had already been spent on them. Still, at least the worst didn't come to pass. At one point, there had been talk of cancelling Psyche altogether, a move akin to not merely cutting off your nose to spite your face, but also gouging out your own eyes and then kicking yourself in the testicles. Thankfully, that danger has passed. At the time of writing, the Psyche probe is due to be launched from the Kennedy Space Center aboard a SpaceX Falcon Heavy in October this year. So now seems like a pretty good time to meet the craft itself. We mentioned earlier some of the instruments that the Psyche probe will be equipped with and how they'll be used to suss out the true nature of Psyche the asteroid. And yes, we agree, it is rather confusing that NASA have given the craft the exact same name as the asteroid that it's going to visit. I mean, there's a good reason they don't call every new Mars rover Mars and hope we'll know the difference. Thank you, NASA. Names aside, though, there are a couple of very cool things about the spacecraft Psyche that we've not yet mentioned. 2 things that are adjacent to its main mission of exploring this metal world, but could still be transformative: its method of propulsion and communication. And let's start with propulsion, shall we? Like a handful of recent craft, from Dawn to Bepi Colombo, Psyche doesn't use chemical propellant, instead relying on ion thrusters to move through space. For you Star Wars fans out there, that's the same type of propulsion used by the Empire's TIE fighters. Although Psyche's version is a lot less dramatic. By accelerating xenon gas inside an electric field, the thrusters are able to blast out charged ions at high speed to generate thrust. Admittedly, a very low level of thrust, about 240 millinewtons, or the amount of force needed to hold up a single AA battery. In the vacuum of space, though, even that tiny thrust accumulates over time to propel the craft to high speeds, all while giving it better maneuverability than a chemically powered probe. According to NASA, the specific type of ion thruster they're using, Hall thrusters, have never been used beyond the orbit of our moon before, so Psyche is going to be a pioneer of sorts. Even more pioneering, though, will be the new communication system. On an infotainment channel like this one, it can be hard to get people excited about stuff like communication technology. I mean, would you rather hear about freaky metal asteroids or about how NASA uses the space equivalent of dial-up? But communicating with spacecraft is the cornerstone of these missions. After all, it doesn't matter how much data your probe collects if you can't then send it back to Earth. And Psyche will be testing a new way of getting back far more data than usual. Rather than radio waves, the craft will, to quote JPL's mission website, encode data in photons at near-infrared wavelength, something that will allow more data to be sent in any given amount of time. Exactly how much more remains to be seen, but we've seen estimates of anywhere between 10 and 100 times more. That's the equivalent of switching from dial-up to broadband. Assuming it works well, this is a method we'll doubtless soon see on other NASA missions, a minor yet important change that'll make doing science shit oh so much easier. And science is exactly what the Psyche craft was born to do. As we've mentioned, this video is being written at a time before the craft launches. Given the uncertain launch window and the fact that this is a brand new channel, thanks for being here, we can't say for certain if it'll be published before or after the probe finally blasts off for the stars. What we can say, though, is that whenever you finally see this, Psyche's team are preparing for the journey of a lifetime. After taking off on a Falcon Heavy, the probe will head off on a long looping journey that will last 6 years. First, it'll swing by Mars in 2026 for a gravity assist, coming within 3,000 kilometers of the Martian surface and using the planet's gravity to send itself hurling off toward the asteroid belt on a new trajectory. There, it'll make its way towards its target, the asteroid it shares a name with, the strange metal asteroid that has intrigued planetary scientists for years. And then finally, in August of 2029, Psyche the craft will enter orbit around Psyche the asteroid. Having traveled 3.6 billion kilometers, it'll drop down until it is a mere 75 kilometers above the asteroid's surface. At that point, at long last, the real mission will begin. The slow, yet unstoppable revealing of Psyche's secrets as we discover the truth of this far-off metal world. In space-themed scripts on other channels, and in some we've already written for this one, talk of future missions often ends with us contemplating something that will happen in the far future. A probe that will reach its target in, 2050, or Mars samples that won't reach Earth until well into the next decade. With Psyche, though, all this will happen in just 6 short years. 6 short years before we get to meet this unusual asteroid and discover whether it really is the exposed core of some long-dead world. We don't know about you, but for us that's pretty exciting, and we can only hope that you're still with us in the audience when that day finally comes. Hopefully, you'll still be around for our follow-up video on Psyche and the newly uncovered history of the mysterious metal world.